On May 11, 2021, in a town outside of Athens, Greece, law enforcement officers arrived at the residence of a young couple. When they entered the master bedroom, they discovered the swollen blue body of a 19-year-old woman. Next to her, lying in bed, was an infant, crying, but thankfully unharmed. Near the stairwell, crime scene investigators came across a gruesome discovery. A small dog was hanging by its leash on the banister. Who murdered this beautiful young mother, and who was the monster who tortured and killed the family pet? Hello, and welcome to Shades of Murder. I am your host, Alita Caldwell. Each episode, I discuss a case of murder throughout history and around the world, attempting to unfold the layers of darkness that help make humans into monsters. Please be forewarned that each episode contains specific and at times very graphic and disturbing details of the case. This show is not intended for all audiences, and listener discretion is strongly advised. Caroline Crouch was the daughter of David Crouch, a retired British gas and oil executive, and Susanna. Her mother was born and raised in the Philippines. Caroline grew up on the beautiful island of Alunosos, a Greek island off of the Aegean Sea. But when she got older, her family decided to establish roots on the mainland. When the lovely and smart 15-year-old Caroline was introduced to dashing 28-year-old pilot Babis Agnatopoulos, she fell instantly smitten with him. Babis was successful, charming, and very handsome. Caroline was radiant, young, and full of life. Despite their significant age difference, there were no major concerns from her family regarding the relationship. The couple married only 3 days after her 18th birthday. Caroline would become pregnant shortly after, and they would welcome a little girl, Lydia, into the world. The love-struck twosome would be married for a little over a year, when their fairy-tale romance would unravel into darkness. On the morning of May 11, 2021, emergency dispatchers received a call from a frantic husband who said that his wife had been murdered. The residence was that of pilot and flight instructor Babis Agnatopoulos and his beautiful young wife, Caroline. When law enforcement officers arrived at the scene, the man was in an absolute wreck. He was shaking and crying uncontrollably, screaming out that they had killed his wife. Babis was visibly overwhelmed with emotion, having been traumatized by what had happened to his family. He told police officers that armed robbers had broken into his home early that morning, and his wife and dog had been slain during a botched home invasion. He claimed that the burglars had tied him and his wife up and had pointed a gun at their baby's head. They placed tape around his neck, put him in restraints, and shoved him underneath the bed. The tape around his neck must have obstructed his airway because at some point he blacked out. When he came to, he was devastated to discover his lovely wife Caroline dead in their bed. Babis was beyond grateful to see his baby infant girl lying next to his wife, who appeared to be unharmed. The same could not be said for their dog Roxy. One of the perpetrators had strangled her with its leash, hanging her along the banister of the stairs. He also reported that around 15,000 euros in cash, which equated to 18,000 US dollars, had been stolen from their home. Law enforcement initially posted a reward of 300,000 euros for information that could lead to finding the monsters who had brutally murdered this young wife and mother and the family dog. The Civil Protection Minister of Greece publicly condemned the crime as being barbarous, and they made it their top priority to bring to justice the perpetrators of this horrendous crime. Babis provided the police with a specific description of the man whom he believed had murdered his wife. He described the suspect as overweight and tall, with a dark complexion, and likely under 30. Given that Babis had specifically said that the violent perpetrators appeared to be Albanian or Georgian, officers began focusing on organized crime within the region, in particular, those which involved any known criminals of Albanian or Georgian descent. Within a few days, they made their first arrest. A Georgian man who was crossing over into Bulgaria was taken into custody. However, the man had an alibi and was released soon after. The grieving widow cried out to the media about how a gang of merciless foreign robbers had senselessly murdered his beautiful young wife. Barbarous spoke of how he hoped that such violence would not happen to anyone else, so no one else has to suffer the way he and his family were. Barbarous also expressed faith that the police would catch the offenders. All of Greece sobbed and grieved right alongside the heartbroken husband and shared in his unspeakable loss and pain. Barbarous posted a photo from their wedding on his Instagram account 5 days after he lost his beloved wife with the message, "Always together. Farewell, my love." The press captured him hugging Caroline's mother, Susanna, during his wife's memorial, consoling one another in their unimaginable grief. Barbarous Agnatopoulos was seen after the funeral at the gravesite of his murdered wife, holding their baby daughter Lydia in his arms for over 4 hours. He played the role of the heartbroken husband flawlessly. But homicide investigators believe the truth of what happened that night was much darker and close to home. Law enforcement officers noticed discrepancies in the husband's story and began to investigate every moment of the alleged events. The data retrieved from the activity tracker app on Barbarous Agnatopoulos' cell phone and his deceased wife's smartwatch would help break open the case. During the time frame when he claimed to be tied up and unconscious under the bed, his phone proved otherwise. At the precise time, Barbarous alleged that he had blacked out while his wife was being attacked and killed. The activity tracker on his phone showed him moving around his residence. It was also observed that during this time, his wife had already been dead. Caroline's smartwatch revealed that her pulse rate increased by 50% after the time that Barbarous said she was already dead. Barbarous also informed police that the gang of thieves had obstructed the security camera at their residence. However, investigators discovered, per the data on the memory card, that it had been removed at 1:20 a.m. since the robbers supposedly broke into their house 5 hours after. The credibility of his story further fell apart. The truth behind their almost storybook marriage was revealed when investigators came upon Caroline Crouch's journal. Several entries directly implied that she was fed up with her abusive and toxic marriage, and that she was planning on leaving Barbarous once Lydia turned 1 year old. There is no record of what happened after this most recent entry, since she never got the chance to leave him. But Caroline wrote about the physical and emotional fights between her and her husband. She was not a completely defenseless, fragile young woman as some perceived her to be. She held a black belt in kickboxing, and in one particularly nasty altercation between the couple, she hit Barbarous and broke down one of their doors. Homicide investigators had collected enough evidence to support an arrest. On June 17, 2021, Barbarous Agnatopoulos was picked up and brought in for questioning after his late wife's memorial service. Detectives casually approached Barbarous on the island following the service and asked if he would accompany them back to Athens to help identify a suspect. Barbarous didn't hesitate to go with them since law enforcement officers had told him that there had been a possible break in the case. Once he arrived at the department, law enforcement investigators confronted him with the holes in his story about the home burglary and how his deceased wife's smartwatch revealed conflicts in the time frame. After 8 hours of interrogation, Barbarous Agnatopoulos' lies were shattered. He knew that there were no more tales he could fabricate. His ideal life had crumbled, and he was solely to blame. When the world learned about the truth behind the murder of Caroline Crouch and her beloved rescue pup, Roxy, the deep sympathy and heartbreak once held for the husband quickly turned to shock and disgust. This was especially true for the residents of Greece, who felt hoodwinked, manipulated, and played fools by a monster wearing the mask of a grieving husband. Based on the forensic autopsy, the state coroner believed that Caroline Crouch went through extensive suffering at the hands of her husband. The following sequence of events is believed to be what happened the night she was murdered. That evening, the couple allegedly got into an eruptive fight over their daughter Lydia. The details of their argument remain unknown. Caroline left the argument and headed up their bedroom to go to sleep, while Barbarous fell asleep on the couch downstairs. When he awoke sometime in the middle of the night, he went upstairs to try to make up with his wife. However, Caroline refused to apologize and wanted nothing to do with him. Barbarous kept trying to touch her, pawing at her, but she rejected his advances. He would not accept her denial. Barbarous climbed on top of her and mercilessly pinned Caroline down. "No one rejects me," he allegedly thought to himself, and his rage boiled over. He clasped his hand over his wife's mouth and grabbed a pillow, placing it over her face. Barbarous held it down firm, listening to her struggling for air. He watched as her body violently shook, doing everything it could to resist her grim fate. For 5 minutes, which must have felt endless to her, Caroline struggled to survive against her much stronger and larger husband. Barbarous listened as his wife's screams turned to silence underneath the pillow. According to Barbarous Agnatopoulos' confession, after he killed Caroline, he broke down into tears, and instant panic began to settle in. He paced the room feverishly, pulling at his hair, when the truth of what he had done really sank in. He had just suffocated his wife. Their 11-month-old baby girl was now without her mother. What would he do now? He couldn't admit what he had done. He certainly didn't want to go to prison, and he couldn't let Lydia be without a dad, too. Then an idea popped into his head. Yes, that is the answer. He could say that it was a home burglary. They were some foreign thugs who broke into the house in the middle of the night and in the chaos attacked and murdered his wife. To make his home invasion murder story appear to be more believable, it wasn't just Caroline Barbarous needed to kill that night. He knew the lie would not be easy to sell to investigators if there weren't signs of rash and brutal violence. In a moment of madness, Barbarous snatched up his wife's little rescue puppy, Roxy. He hung it on the banister by its leash. He promptly left and hid in the kitchen, listening to the poor little dog whimper for a few seconds before it stopped breathing and died. Afterward, he called the police and reported the home burglary and murder of his wife. While Barbarous Agnatopoulos sat in jail awaiting his criminal trial, his little girl turned almost 3. Her maternal grandfather, David Crouch, stated in the media that his main concern and priority was raising his late daughter's child, Lydia. Lydia was now residing in the Philippines with Caroline's mother, Susanna, and the family of Caroline's half-sister. After the brutal murder, sole custody of Lydia had been granted the Crouch family. Under a court order, Barbarous Agnatopoulos' parents were permitted to speak to their granddaughter for 1 hour a week, via Skype or other electronic means. I understand completely why Caroline's family wanted exclusive custody, given the circumstances. I am not sure where Barbarous' parents stood on supporting their son, but it must have been extremely painful and a very difficult situation for them too. It is easy to forget about the loved ones of the perpetrators of violent offenses. They are all too easy to blame or simply not care about, but they are often victims of the crime too and suffer right along with the victims' families. However, Caroline's father, David, did not see things in such a light. He was very outspoken about how he would do everything in his power to make sure, and I quote, "the monster who killed her mother, as well as those two ridiculous people who are his parents, never see Lydia again." During his initial trial, Babis Agnatopoulos attempted to paint himself as a man so in love, who never intended to harm his wife. He referred to his late wife Caroline as the love of my love. Over 10 hours, he poured out his heart to the tribunal court, speaking of the great love he held for his wife, and that in a moment of rage, he asphyxiated her. According to observers, not only was Babis eloquent, calm, and composed, but it appeared as if he was enjoying all of the attention. When the prosecution presented the evidence of Caroline Crouch's diary to the court, it was observed how Babis completely broke down in tears, sobbing, when he heard out loud the words of his late wife. She had intended to leave him within a month of their marriage. She realized she had made a huge mistake, and it was only when she realized she was pregnant that she decided to do her best to make it work for their child. But things just kept getting worse. It was also observed by those in the courtroom that Babis Agnatopoulos held a great deal of legal knowledge and was as effective of a speaker as any lawyer. Before the defendant took the stand, psychiatrist Alcestis Agnomenakis, who had examined him, testified that all evidence indicated that the murder was premeditated. She addressed how Babis Agnatopoulos was believed to be suffering from severe antisocial personality disorder, with a specific emphasis on narcissism. According to her evaluation, Babis expressed zero remorse, no empathy, and exhibited signs of a superiority complex, not to mention the disturbing cruelty of placing his baby next to her mother, whom he had just brutally murdered. His trial was expected to last several months, but then it abruptly stopped, and the court went on a break for 3 weeks. It was reported to the court that Babis Agnatopoulos' lawyer had fallen ill and had been placed in the hospital. I have thought before about the weight of darkness a defense attorney must feel when they represent and fight for someone whom they know has committed such a heinous crime. Don't get me wrong, the work and value of defense attorneys are priceless, and their profession is often criticized and even villainized for representing those charged with violent crimes. I will always stand behind what they do because it is critical to upholding the legal system, especially our rights as citizens. Most of us are also aware that there are plenty of innocent people who are faced with the most serious of charges, including rape and murder, who are innocent. So their roles in the criminal justice system cannot be underrated. But for those who are not innocent, it must be very taxing on the spirit, mind, and body to do everything possible to help your client get away with the most horrible of crimes imaginable, or in the very least receive the lowest possible penalty. When his trial continued, the tribunal court saw through his epic performance, and they unanimously found Babis Agnatopoulos guilty of the premeditated first-degree murder of his wife Caroline Crouch, and for animal cruelty for the senseless killing of her dog. He received a sentence equivalent to 15.5 years for the murder of his wife, 10 years for animal abuse for murdering her dog, and 1.5 years for perverting the course of justice. Babis Agnatopoulos was transferred to Korydallos prison, considered the toughest penal institution in Greece, to serve out his sentence. This sounds like a light sentence compared to the United States, whose current crime control model prioritizes deterrence and punishment. We currently have some of the most severe penalties in the world, But Babis Agnatopoulos' term of imprisonment is harsh by many country standards. In Greece, the criminal justice system is based on a rehabilitation model, so 27 years is considered a very severe penal sentence. Life imprisonment defined under its law is incarceration up to a maximum of 20 years before a convicted individual is eligible for parole. This penalty is specifically designated for those who receive more than one life sentence, such as those who commit mass murder or a serial killer. If an individual kills only one person, they are eligible for parole after only 16 years. The reason that Babis Agnatopoulos even received 27 years was because the judge added 10 years to his sentence for killing his wife's dog. Now, as a proud and fiercely protective dog mom of a rescue Staffordshire Pit Bull mix, I love that the criminal justice system in Greece stands up for animals who have been abused and killed, especially since their breeds tend to be the most inflicted by human neglect and harm. In November 2020, the Greek Parliament voted to enact some of the strongest animal cruelty laws in the world. Not only is it against the law to chain, starve, or beat an animal, but a perpetrator will face a minimum of 1 year in jail and fines between 5,000 and 15,000 euros, which is slightly more than its equivalent in US dollars. For someone who seriously abuses an animal, which includes poisoning, burning, mutilation, hanging, shooting, they could be sentenced to up to 10 years in prison. In 2021, Greece established pet legislation that creates rules so that no animal is abused or abandoned. Some of these provisions are nothing short of amazing. For example, if someone has been found guilty of torturing an animal, their information will be placed into a database that is managed by the prosecutor's office in Athens. There, they will cross-reference this data with anyone on the pet registry, which prevents offenders from owning another animal after they have committed an offense against one. Greece also has a pet DNA analysis and storage system that will locate the offender if they have abandoned an animal, so they can be prosecuted and punished. The sale of pets is only legal by approved breeders, and owners are permitted 1 litter per animal. All other pets must be neutered outside of approved animal breeders, with fines of 1,000 euros if this law is ignored. In addition, there is a national pet registry where all pets, whether they are owned or strays, must have their information registered. If only the United States were the same and regarded our beloved pets with the same protection and rights. Our laws in this country against animal cruelty are a joke. Now, the only thing I do find troubling about their severe penalties and punishment for animal abusers is that it seems to reflect how little women's lives are of value there in the culture and under the law. Greece is a country that is deeply affected by violence against women, and in recent years, domestic homicide has increased at an alarming rate. According to a 2023 report conducted by the European Data Journalism Network, Greece had the highest increase in femicide across Europe in 2021. Between 2020 and 2021, the murder of women rose from 8 victims to 23, which was an increase of 187.5%. During the years of the pandemic, the crime of femicide spiked on an international scale, which severely impacted the safety of women and children in their homes. This startling rise has inspired women to speak out, demanding that femicide be acknowledged as its own crime, and lawmakers have finally begun to listen. Unfortunately, as of the most recent legislation, only 3 European states, including Slovakia, Cyprus, and Malta, have declared femicide as such. What some find to be even more concerning is the lack of data surrounding gender-based crime. Since 2018, no official data has been released by the European Union. A survey conducted in 2020 by the European Institute for Gender Equity has yet to be published. The United States is not any better, as we do not have a separate penal code for femicide, even though every day, an average of 3 women are killed by their intimate partner. 3 women every single day. So what is femicide, and why should it be considered a separate, specific type of murder? The term was first introduced during testimony at the International Tribunal on Crimes Against Women in 1976 by Diana Russell. In her words, femicide is defined as, and I quote, "the murders of women by men motivated by hatred, contempt, pleasure, or a sense of ownership of women." The primary reason this term is so pertinent to the conversation of domestic violence is that it is critical to the study so we can understand the sociocultural reasons behind why men kill women. Over the last several decades, this definition has expanded to encompass the motives and agenda of the patriarchy and its violent-infused institutions. For example, the rape and murder of women during times of war. The current laws in Greece do very little to prioritize the protection and safety of women who are victims of domestic violence. A bill recently introduced by the Ministry of Justice focused on combating this epidemic of violence against women in Greece. It was voted for in Parliament and set forth new processes for more rapid prosecution and harsher penalties for the offenders. However, there is nothing in the law that specifies how it speeds up the process, and it fails to prioritize criminal trials against those charged with domestic violence. The story of a recent victim of intimate partner violence places it into perspective how fatally dangerous it is to be a woman in Greece. In April 2024, 28-year-old Kyriaki Griva frantically ran to the police for help. She saw her abusive ex-boyfriend lurking outside of her home and was petrified of what he may do to her. In 2020, she had been granted a restraining order against him for allegations of abuse and rape. Accompanied by a friend, she walked to the nearest local police station in Athens and pleaded for their help. According to the police, even though she made a report, she didn't want to file an official complaint about her ex violating the court order. When asked if they would please take her home, the on-duty officers refused to provide her with transportation. They directed her to call the emergency police number instead. Kyriaki left the police station and called the emergency call center line. She told the operator that she was terrified of her former boyfriend who was stalking her. Kyriaki asked him if they would please send a patrol car to pick her up at the station and take her back home so she was safe. The male emergency dispatcher replied to her that the police vehicles are not a taxi service and abruptly hung up on her. Kyriaki and her friend were being watched. Her ex-boyfriend had followed her to the police station, waiting for her to come out. While still holding the phone in her hand, he ambushed her, stabbing her in the back multiple times with a knife. 28-year-old Kyriaki Griva bled out only steps away from the door of the local police. Her ex-boyfriend then turned the knife upon himself. He was arrested and taken into custody before he could successfully take his own life. The suspect was arrested and placed in a prison psychiatric ward at his request. This horrifying incident led to global news coverage and was evidence of the lack of concern, sympathy, and absence of protection there are for female victims of domestic abuse. It illuminated the patriarchal structure of Greece and its laws, which continue to fail to protect women from femicide. As a result, 6 police officers were removed from duty at the Athens police station where this tragedy occurred. An investigation was launched into the emergency call center, which led to 5 more officers being removed from duty. The reason this discussion is so relevant to this case is that the murder of Caroline Crouch and the grotesque cover-up by her husband brought this topic much-needed exposure. It highlighted how even the most fairy tale of marriages and the most affluent of women are not immune to intimate partner violence. Several aspects of Babis and Caroline's relationship are relevant to the discussion of intimate partner violence. Studies have revealed that there tends to be a large age difference between the male offender and the female victim. This makes sense to some extent because it would be hypothetically easier to lure in, manipulate, and exert control over someone who may be less mature, less experienced, and therefore more vulnerable to such abuse. Caroline Crouch was a beautiful young 15-year-old girl when she met the much older, charming, and handsome pilot. She was instantly taken with him, and despite their age difference, there were no major concerns from her family. However, that doesn't mean there was not an imbalance of power and control, and that she was not more susceptible and vulnerable to his charming manipulation. There are some differences in how young women are perceived in Europe at this age. Part of this has to do with the age of drinking there, which is legally 16. So they are viewed a little more sophisticated and mature at this age versus a 15-year-old teenage girl in the United States. I've had personal experience with this when I traveled to Europe at 14 years old. I was treated as if I were a young woman by the men there, even though I was still a child. I address this because in this country, we would see their relationship as disgusting, perverse, and that Babis Anaktopoulos was a child predator. But there are some distinct cultural differences that didn't make their relationship and age gap as shocking as it would be in the US, not to mention illegal. Under the laws in Greece, the age of consent is 15 years old. For most of the European Union states, this age ranges between 14 and 16. In 7 member states, including Austria, Bulgaria, Estonia, Germany, Hungary, Italy, and Portugal, one only has to be 14 to consent to sexual activity, no matter the age of the partner. In the United States, the average age of consent is 16, with California being rare at 18 years old. But that doesn't mean that a 30-year-old can have sexual relationships with a 16-year-old. This depends on the state, and the laws vary wildly. The couple was married only 3 days after her 18th birthday, which is the legal age of marriage in Greece. Interestingly, there is no set age within their legislation, nor is there in most European countries. Diagnosed with severe antisocial personality disorder, with a focus on narcissism, Babis Anaktopoulos felt no empathy or remorse for what he had done to his wife. He viewed her as an obstacle that he got rid of in a moment of rage. Babis utilized his good looks, charisma, and skills at manipulation to lie and fool everyone around him into believing he was a heartbroken husband. Narcissism has been found in some studies to be a strong predictor in men who commit intimate partner violence. As mentioned in previous episodes, narcissism is characterized by a strong sense of entitlement, an abnormally unhealthy degree of self-love and self-admiration, and the incessant need to be admired, approved, and praised by everyone in their life. Specifically, vulnerable narcissism appears to have a stronger correlation with physical and sexual intimate partner violence than those of grandiose narcissism, which tend to be more psychological. An individual with vulnerable narcissism has traits of a fragile ego and self-esteem. They are hypersensitive to rejection, and their romantic relationships can trigger violent abuse. Intimate partner violence is centered around power, psychological manipulation, and control. When the abuser loses that hold over their victim, this is when the abused is most vulnerable to being killed. Did Babis Anaktopoulos know that Caroline was planning to leave him? And he would lose both his wife and his infant daughter. The couple were not lavishly wealthy, but quite affluent compared to many struggling Greek citizens. Perhaps he read her journal and realized that it was over between them, and he didn't want to have to continue to financially support her. whether Caroline's murder was premeditated or not became the focus of his appellate case. Babis Agnostopoulos' lawyer in his appellate hearing claimed that his client should not be punished for a murder that was never premeditated. Now, I will presume that he conveyed to the judges that his client's sentence should not be as harsh as those who have committed first-degree premeditated murder. His lawyer also stressed how Babis Agnostopoulos is a model prisoner, sharing how he reads often and works in the prison canteen. Model prisoner, so was Edmund Kemper, and many other charming psychopaths who are intelligent and charismatic enough to manipulate those around them so effortlessly that no one even realizes they are doing it. This man, who swore to love and protect his young wife before smothering her in front of his infant daughter, claimed that there were mitigating circumstances around the homicide, and that he didn't deserve the 27 years he was given. In an interview with Caroline's father, David Crouch, he made a strong statement as to where he stands on the issue of femicide and how he perceives his former son-in-law. And I quote, "It is absolutely despicable that my daughter's killer is trying to get his prison sentence reduced because of his good behavior. The crime committed by the murderer, that of femicide, is a heinous crime that should deserve particularly severe punishment. In my opinion, men who kill their wives, for whatever reason, are the lowest of the low, ranking alongside pedophiles. I think it will be a sad day for women when the murderer of a defenseless woman who slept with her child will serve less than his full prison sentence. This man is beyond contempt." Then, in a sudden and quite shocking turn, Babis Agnostopoulos stopped fighting to appeal his life sentence. There were no reasons given except in his own words, which his lawyer conveyed to the court, that for extremely serious reasons, his client had decided to abruptly stop all legal proceedings in an attempt to overturn his prison term. This is very mysterious and interesting to me, and to this day, there is no additional information as to why Babis Agnostopoulos decided to do this. However, the letter he wrote to his mother-in-law, Susanna, does raise some questions as to what actually led to Caroline Crouch being murdered, and by whose hands. His version of events, which he wrote in a letter addressed to Caroline's mother, Susanna, goes as follows. Babis Agnostopoulos claimed that a group of dangerous criminals had approached him to do a job for them, in which he would be richly compensated. According to Babis, his wife was pissed and unwilling to go along with this plan. She influenced her husband to back out of the deal he had already committed to do with this gang. On the night of May 11th, the group broke into their home to take back the money that had already been given to Babis. They tortured his wife Caroline to tell them where their valuables were. Babis swore that the gang told him that if he didn't confess to murdering his wife, they would come after everyone in his life, including threatening the life of his infant daughter Lydia. This is when the idea of staging the crime scene to appear as a home burglary came to Babis. He figured that it was the only way to conceal the true identity of who had murdered Caroline. Babis Agnostopoulos swore in the letter to her mother, Susanna, that it destroyed his entire life becoming involved with the gang of drug smugglers, and that in order to protect their daughter, he was forced to say he killed her. According to Caroline's father, David Crouch, he believed his son-in-law was involved in smuggling drugs. In an interview done with Antenna TV, he claimed that shortly before his daughter was killed, Babis had been approached by a friend who owned a dining establishment in Athens who wanted him to distribute some drugs for him. Caroline's father claimed that it was supposed to be a one-time deal, a situation that Babis would have been paid handsomely for. He believed that Babis stupidly told his wife about the offer, and she was outraged. Caroline threatened to leave him and move to the Philippines with her infant daughter Lydia. When Babis wanted out, he was already too far involved with them, and the criminals threatened to murder his wife. Her father claimed that Babis ended up killing Caroline himself because if he hadn't, the drug smugglers would have killed him too. This is all hearsay, and there has been no supporting evidence to prove his claims. When the news broke that Babis was no longer contesting his sentence, Caroline's father felt a dark cloud lift off him, although he still held some disbelief that Babis was actually done appealing his penalty. He felt like he could breathe a little. David Crouch noted how each time their son-in-law appears in court and attempts to justify his daughter's murder, it was like a reoccurring nightmare for himself and his family. David acknowledged how his daughter's killer is a born actor and that he doesn't believe that Babis is the kind of person to accept his life sentence. Only time will tell, and depending on whether or not his model behavior and successful rehabilitation continues, Babis Agnatopoulos has a strong chance of earning parole after his sentence of 27 years has been fulfilled. This includes the 10 additional years he was given for murdering his wife's puppy, and 1.5 additional years for perverting the course of justice by laying the blame on burglars. He was 35 years old when he decided to end the appellate process, which was 5 years after he murdered Caroline. Babis will likely be released from the high-security jail in Malandrinos when he is in his late 50s. Statistics show that most men and criminals in general age out of crime, but for certain crimes, like violence against women and sex crimes, the data has been very disturbing. Research shows that for men with a tendency toward intimate partner violence and sexual assault, their older age does not appear to minimize the risk, and sometimes it increases the chances. While serving out his sentence, Babis Agnatopoulos has become the latest in a long list of murderers, sexual offenders, and other vile criminals who have captured the attention of females. As disturbing and gross as it may be, most of you are likely already aware of how relatively common it is for convicted criminals, including serial rapists and serial killers, to draw in obsessed female admirers. From Ted Bundy to Richard Ramirez, women have been known to flock to the most dangerous and psychotic of criminals. Babis Agnatopoulos, a young and attractive pilot, is no exception. It was noted by his prison guards how shocked they were by the sheer number of fans of the wife killer. He has received bags of letters from admirers, the majority being Greek women, who profess their love to this murderer. Many of these women are not just attracted to murderers and other violent criminals, but they have a tendency to believe that they can save them in some way, or that they are innocent of the crime. For Babis Agnatopoulos, it was reported by the guards who, based on prison protocol, have to go through and read all the mail prisoners receive. These women attempt to justify his actions by expressing that his wife's death wasn't premeditated. It was all just in the heat of the moment, the definition of a crime of passion. So in their mind, this mitigates his crime. These types of women help to perpetuate femicide by downplaying its seriousness. Attraction and infatuation with men who murder and violate women glorify their crimes. Law enforcement and the media have portrayed Babis Agnatopoulos as this narcissistic monster who murdered his wife and her dog, and most likely the confession within his letter to Caroline's mother, Susanna, are the ramblings of a psychopath. But what if they aren't? I'm not saying that I believe him, but what is the purpose in spinning this story? It is difficult to deny that the circumstances are a bit strange, especially given that he abruptly stopped the appellate process for, as he said, extremely important reasons. Could these reasons involve the ongoing protection of his daughter? I am just playing devil's advocate here, but what if there is even a tiny possibility that he was telling the truth? It doesn't make any sense why he would initially blame the crime on the gang of thieves, even pretending to help the police find them. And then when law enforcement places their hand and provides the evidence that he murdered Caroline, then he admits to it. Is it possible that the time incarcerated has made him realize how terrible his crimes are and that he deserved to be severely punished? Or was there something else motivating him to change his mind? To have a prisoner all of a sudden decide that they will no longer protest their life sentence is extremely rare and beyond bizarre. Oh, how I wish I knew why. All I know is that stranger than fiction circumstances around homicide cases do happen, and sometimes things and not as they seem. What do you think? Thank you so much for listening. I appreciate each and every one of you, and I am beyond thrilled to be your host. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions you have for the show, please reach out. I would love to hear from you. My contact information you can find in the episode description below. Until next time, stay safe. Watch out for shades of murder happening in the streets, next door, and especially inside your own home. Shades of Murder was created, researched, written, and edited by Alita Caldwell. Original music composed by Stereo Code.